And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay begins with a refusal, the refusal of a clean start. Nothing begins entirely fresh is not just a claim about memory, it's a structural principle. Beneath every apparent origin lies sediment. The paint over primer, the gesture shaped by someone else's hand, the phrase that arrives already carrying history. We tend to imagine beginnings as moments of rupture, clarity, or intention, but what looks new is always built on something else: material, memory, language, design. Origin stories simplify. They offer narrative legibility by covering the layers they stand on. This essay resists that simplification. It suggests that newness is not a state of purity, but a rearrangement of what remains. What we call a beginning is often just a shift in surface, while the deeper structures persist, muted, invisible, but still shaping everything to come. The wall was gone, but the stain remained. A faint rectangle on the brick behind it, darker, almost oily, where a painting once hung. No one remembered the image, only the shape it left behind. And even that memory wasn't personal, just a kind of shared recognition. Something had been there. This is how presence works when it's no longer allowed to announce itself. The outline, the residue, the mark of a removal too deliberate to fully succeed. We like to think things disappear cleanly, that absence can be total. But there are artifacts that refuse compliance. Not relics, not preserved, not even mourned, but persistent. The stain becomes a motif, not a symbol of loss, but of refusal. This is not nostalgia, it is structural memory, evidence that erasure always fails in some dimension. What remains is not chosen. It lingers because it was never fully absorbed, never granted a name or role in the architecture of forgetting. And yet it exerts force. The stain alters how the space is entered. It demands no attention, and still, once seen, it cannot be unseen. There is a politics to this kind of endurance, not protest, not defiance, but a kind of ambient unrest, a refusal to be fully excluded. What disappears still remembers itself, and in doing so it changes what disappearance even means. Avery Gordon called these lingering presences hauntings, not ghost stories, but incomplete forms that expose what was meant to be buried. The outline on the wall may never give back its image, but it gives us something else, the condition of remaining. What refuses to disappear is not a ghost, it is the structure's own memory. Some things are forgotten by design. Others are simply displaced, shuffled out of visible time, but never entirely lost. The difference is crucial. Erasure implies an intent to eliminate. Displacement is quieter, often mistaken for progress. But the displaced adjusts. It finds new surfaces, altered forms, unnoticed corridors, where it can settle without approval. Memory in this sense is not a chamber but a field, irregular, shifting and unevenly charged. The mind might forget a name, but the body recalls a gesture. A city might demolish a block, but the pattern of foot traffic resists the new plan. Displacement does not end presence. It changes its method. We notice this in strange moments, a phrase we've never said that feels familiar, a smell that returns without source, a hesitation before entering a place we've never been. These moments don't fail our understanding. They suggest its limits. What if these are not errors of memory, but the mind remembering in forms it no longer knows how to name? To remain is not to persist unchanged, but to persist without agreement. And that non-consensual survival introduces pressure. What stays is not always welcome. Often it disturbs, asking to be recognized, even if it refuses to explain itself. This is not haunting, it's a kind of epistemic resistance. Gloria Anzaldúa taught us that borderlands are not errors in geography, but conditions of knowing, where contradiction becomes method. What refuses to disappear creates a kind of border in time, an edge we keep trying to cross, but which keeps reshaping the map. Culture often edits its past, polishing rough edges, curating what it is willing to remember. But underneath that curation is sediment. What refuses to disappear is rarely decorative. It unsettles quietly, not because it seeks to, but because it has remained too long in a space designed to outgrow it. There is discipline in what endures, not as virtue, but as structural insistence. Persistence shapes form, often without intention. We tend to think of survival as triumph, but many things survive not through strength, but through refusal to conform. A city forgets its past through construction, yet the forgotten interrupts the present. A stairway that leads nowhere, an arch embedded in a modern wall, an alley that breaks the logic of the grid. These remnants do not belong, and that is their function. They are not part of the narrative. They are its disruption. Institutions bury what no longer fits, but the archive leaks. The suppressed re-enters not as truth, but as irregularity. The sidewalk buckles. The syllabus fails to fully exclude. The language stutters. And in these fractures, memory resumes, not as recall, but as architecture. Remainders don't argue, they impose. They are not asking to be restored. They are instructing the present in the limits of its design. Michel de Chateau traced the power of small acts, residual behaviours that endure beneath systems designed to erase them. These acts don't declare themselves as resistance. They become spatial pressure, interruptions in the logic of modernity. To remain is to reshape the ground, not with authority, but with duration. What refuses to disappear doesn't need to be heard to be known. Its presence is atmospheric, infrastructural, a logic beneath logic. It reminds us that coherence is not the only form of truth. A structure that cannot purge its past is not broken. It is accurate. It tells the truth of accumulation. Not everything that remains should. When we try to recreate the past, we often erase its most honest parts. A retro-styled 1980s bedroom, for instance, assembles its era with surgical precision. Plastic blinds, neon accents, cassette players. But this replication is a fiction. The real 1980s room was layered, a 1970s carpet still soft underfoot, 1950s light fittings casting a glow shaped by a half-century of dust and rewiring. Replication flattens these contradictions. It forgets that the past is not a style, but a sediment. It forgets the way time resists curation. In pursuing aesthetic purity, we violate the very structure of what was lived. The curated room erases the layers that truly remained, not because they were meaningful, but because no one had removed them yet. That is the difference between history and remainder. History is selected. Remainders are unchosen. They are what the purge didn't finish, what the renovation couldn't afford to update. They're often invisible until they interrupt. A creak in the floor no one thought to fix, a light that flickers in an old rhythm, or something quieter, a file that resists deletion, a system prompt that references code long overwritten. These are not affective traces, they are material philosophies. Roland Barthes called it the punctum, the part of an image that pierces through curated meaning, refusing to be resolved. These leftovers function the same way. They show that time does not advance in clean lines. It accretes. To forget that is to mistake memory for aesthetic and presence for performance. But the world is not a theme. It is a misalignment of errors, a friction of durations, a survival of what no one meant to save. And perhaps that's the most faithful way to remember, not by staging the past, but by learning to read the things that never left. The curated world is a kind of violence, not loud, not always intentional, but real. It edits for clarity, for coherence, for legibility. It removes the out of place, the stubborn, the structurally inconvenient. But in doing so, it risks sterilizing what is most alive. To curate is to claim authority over what belongs, and so what doesn't belong or can't be explained becomes a problem. A stain is painted over, an unaligned fixture is replaced, a behavioral glitch is patched in code. These acts are not malicious, but they are eliminations. And here's the fracture. What remains is often what was never intended to mean anything. It is the underside of memory, the residual form that reveals how little control we actually have over what endures. Curation wants history to make sense. Remainder resists that need. It shows us that coherence is a retrofit, not a truth. And this friction between what we try to say and what refuses to leave is where philosophy emerges. Not as solution, but as confrontation. Not all that remains should be romanticized. Some things linger not because they matter, but because no one bothered to remove them. But even then, they instruct. They remind us that we do not live in a world built entirely by design. We live in structures shaped by delay, neglect, stubbornness, inertia. These too are forces. These too are archives. Sara Ahmed notes that some orientations stick, not because we choose them, but because spaces are shaped to hold them. And when we remove the residue in pursuit of the clean, the new, the resolved, We also erase the record of those forces. The philosophy of remainder is not an aesthetics of decay. It is a method of perceiving what outlasts its own utility and asking what truths are buried in its survival. There's a danger in assuming that all persistence is meaningful. Not everything that remains deserves reverence. Some things stay not out of resistance, but because no one has looked closely enough to remove them. A flickering light isn't always a metaphor. Sometimes it's just neglect. And yet, even this negligence speaks. It tells a story not of what we've chosen to keep, but of what we've allowed to accumulate. This is where remainder becomes ethically complex. The stain on the wall may have once held beauty, but now it holds bacteria. Its presence is not an echo, it's an oversight. The past doesn't always remain as wisdom. Sometimes it lingers as liability. To remain, then, is not always to resist. It can also be evade, to persist as an error uncorrected. This complicates the notion of remainder as archive. The archive is often selective, reverent, curated toward preservation. But remainder has no such clarity. It collects whatever survived the last wave of forgetting, regardless of merit. And yet, even in this ambiguity, something instructive arises. What survives without justification forces us to confront the mechanics of attention. Why did this stay while other things vanished? What systems of care, of violence, of oversight allowed it? The stain may not teach us anything in itself, but its endurance maps the silence around it. It reveals the contours of what was never considered worth addressing. Simone Weil wrote that attention is a moral act, not a grasping, but a holding. Her form of attention was not just focused, it was devotional. What remains demands that kind of seeing, not as reverence, but as recognition of what endures without asking to. And maybe, for a moment, we return to it, not to learn, but to understand why we didn't look sooner. To attend to what remains is not an act of recovery, it is an act of submission. Not submission as obedience, but as willingness to be shaped by what does not yield to interpretation. The stain, the fixture, the leftover, these do not ask to be understood. They simply stay, and their staying reshapes the space around them. At some point, the room must be designed around the object no one could remove. This is not nostalgia, it is adaptation. Philosophy often seeks clarity, coherence, resolution. But the remainder defies these ambitions. It cannot be resolved without being destroyed, and so we live with it, or beside it, or beneath it. Sometimes we build over it, pretending it isn't there, only to find its shape re-emerge like an old scar through paint. This is not failure, it is a structural concession to what exceeds repair, a truth that won't perform for us, but also won't leave. The world is full of these truths. Not grand revelations, but small resistances. They appear in the patterns of wear on a doorknob, in the way a path curves where it wasn't supposed to. They remind us that nothing begins entirely fresh. Every act of making happens in a field already occupied, and what occupies it may not be visible or named or wanted. But it is there. We might try to name it, but it doesn't accept the shape. What refuses to disappear remains not as history, but as condition. It is the shadow architecture of the now. We do not choose what stays, but we can choose to notice it. And in that noticing, something shifts, not the stain, not the past, but our sense of what the present is made from. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.